to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, and the University of Iowa's honors program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. And I also thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I thank today's special sponsors, Joyce and Dick Somerville, and Mace and Kay Braverman. So it's my pleasure to introduce Douglas Jones. He is an associate professor in the University of Iowa Computer Science Department. He received his BS in physics from Carnegie-Mellon University, his MS and Ph.D. in computer science from the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. He's a member of Tau Beta Pi, the National Honor Society, and the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi. He received the University of Iowa Office of Services for the Handicapped Certificate of Recognition. He has participated in several non-governmental organizations, including Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. Doug has studied, commented on, and published extensively on voting systems in Iowa and many other states, plus several foreign countries. Please welcome Douglas Jones.
Thank you. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the campaign rhetoric that we've heard over the past year. The phrase that was shouted from the rafters last spring was, "The system is rigged." Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were both talking about a rigged political system a year ago. From the start of the campaign in April 2015, Sanders emphasized over and over how our political system and economic system are rigged in favor of the wealthy. And by May of 2016, he was more pointed, saying that the Democratic Party's delegate selection process was rigged by the party's system of superdelegates. At the same time, Trump was making similar statements. In April 2016, speaking in Albany, he said, "I'm hundreds of delegates ahead, but the system, folks, is rigged. It's a rigged, disgusting, dirty system." Initially, he was talking about the Republican Party's delegate selection system. In mid-March, he even warned CNN that, "I think you would have riots if he does not get the nomination." In one sense, both these candidates had a point. They were outsiders, and both the Democratic and Republican parties have created delegate selection processes that favor the party establishment. This is a natural feature of political parties. It's not all bad. A party without an establishment would become a political machine that flies left and right at random in the winds of political zeitgeist. As the two parties finished their nomination process, giving us a race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Trump's rhetoric shifted. He continued talking about a rigged system, but now his focus was on the general election. In early August, Trump told the Washington Post that if the election is rigged, I wouldn't be surprised. He based this on the overturning of voter ID requirements in several states. Addressing other audiences, he stated outright that the election is going to be rigged. In October, Trump focused on the millions of dead people still on the voter rolls. This theme continued even after the election, when Trump blamed his loss in the popular vote on over 3 million illegals who had voted in the election, mostly in California. There is a very strong sense in which our national presidential election system is rigged, and that is written into the Constitution. The Electoral College biases the presidential election in favor of smaller states. A voter in Wyoming has more than twice the clout in the presidential election compared to a voter in California, because Wyoming's one congressional district gets 3 electoral votes, while California's 53 districts get 55 electoral votes. Trump was not complaining about this. Trump's concern with our voter registration system has a basis in fact. In general, our voter registration lists are very poorly maintained. When people move across state lines, they frequently fail to cancel their old registration when they obtain a new one. When people die, their voter registration records frequently live on. Driver's license offices are now required to offer voter registration materials when they issue a license, and this has resulted in the occasional non-citizen ending up inadvertently registered to vote. The vast majority of errors in our voter registration system do not translate into illegal votes. By and large, the dead do not vote. The vast majority of those who are registered in more than one state not only don't vote twice, but don't even know that they're still registered at their old residence. Our voter records in Iowa are typically bad, as anyone who volunteers to make phone calls for a political campaign will learn. I gather you have. That does not, however, translate into fraud. When Iowa Secretary of State Matt Schultz investigated voter fraud in Iowa between 2012 and 2014, at a cost of $250,000, he found very little. Granting him the most generous definition of voter fraud, the rate he found was under 1 vote in 10,000. And of those illegal votes, many were cast in error. Most, in fact. For example, by convicted felons whose voting rights had been restored and where that restoration had later been revoked, not necessarily informing the felon of the revocation. So he thought his rights had been restored. It's noteworthy that the vast majority of voters that Schultz found to have cast questionable ballots had proper ID. We routinely issue driver's licenses to non-citizens and convicted felons. Trump's initial complaints about the overturning of voter ID laws leading to massive voter fraud are not justified by any studies I've seen of illegal voting. Under these circumstances, proposals for voter ID requirements are far more likely to bar legitimate voters from voting than they are to prevent fraud. Trump's rhetoric echoes a pattern that has continued since the election of 2000. When someone raises questions about the election integrity, the answer from those whose election was questioned has frequently been this: yes, we are also concerned about voter fraud. Note the deft pivot from election integrity to voter fraud. Election integrity is a property of the system as a whole, with huge administrative components. Voter fraud, on the other hand, is a criminal matter that justifies police action against individual voters. Trump's election fraud rhetoric may have been largely intended to motivate his supporters. By baiting them with the threat posed by an army of illegal voters intent on supporting his opposition, he could drive them to work harder. There's a big downside risk to this, though, and that is that he could drive them to work harder by engaging in their own counterfraud. A robust democracy requires the consent of the electorate to abide by the rules and accept the result of the election. Widespread belief in a rigged system leads to a cynical and even contemptuous attitude toward the rules. If you believe that they are cheating, then by gum, you have a license to cheat just as much. So how do we defend the system? When I wrote my book, Broken Ballots, I made a point of looking not just at the technology of today's elections, but how we came to vote using machinery in the first place. In the United States, the transition from hand-counted paper ballots to voice voting began after the Civil War, sparked by large-scale revelations of the extent of election fraud. The first generation of practical voting machines were developed in response to this, and it was defense against election fraud that drove the initial acceptance of voting machines, starting in the 1880s. By the 1920s, most urban areas were using voting machines, although in Chicago and Louisiana, largely for reasons I think of entrenched political machines, it took until the 1950s for machines to be adopted. The election fraud that drew so much attention in the 19th century was not the retail voter fraud to which Trump has referred so loudly. It was on a wholesale scale, the work of corrupt political machines, both urban and rural. Much of this involved ballot box stuffing or other forms of corruption at the polling place. Boss Tweed's political machine in New York, Tammany Hall, was in the headlines, and when federal marshals took over the administration of federal elections in Harrison County, Texas, they found that about a third more ballots were counted in the state and local races than in the federal races, despite observers who agreed that every voter had voted in both races. This was clear evidence that the state and local box had been stuffed. Voting machines were successful in the United States for two reasons. First, hand counting in a U.S. general election is a big problem. Few other countries in the world construct ballots as complex as those we vote on routinely. Second, most of the corruption we faced was carried out at the precinct level by election officials. Numerous cases were uncovered where precinct officials announced totals without bothering to count the ballot. In one New York precinct, a New York Times reporter observed a Tammany Hall official eating ballots of which he disapproved during the count. It's one way to dispose of them. Voting machines were seen by the good government movement as a tool in the battle against election fraud because they transfer much of the responsibility for the conduct of the election from precinct election officials to the technicians in the county building. Of course, this means that they also transfer the potential for fraud from the precinct to the technicians. But this was not immediately obvious in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With the advent of electronic voting in the late 20th century, much of the responsibility and potential for fraud have been transferred onward from the county building to the technicians working for the voting machine vendors. When faced with the transition to voting machines, political machines took time to adapt. In many cases, the political machines found it easier to shift their focus from precinct-level fraud to voter registration than it was to corrupt the machines. Literacy tests, laws barring non-citizens from voting, and a variety of other measures became popular as voting machines were put in place. Of course, some polling place fraud still persists, as was proven by the corrupt Clay County, Kentucky political machine that was broken up in 2009. None of their precinct-level manipulations were prevented by the use of modern electronic voting systems. The Clay County machine was a delightful operation that appeared to be involved both in the marijuana business and in selling victory in local elections to the highest bidder. It was thoroughly corrupt. And that's recent. How do we defend against corrupt voting machine technicians? The possibility that voting machine technicians might be corrupt occurred to several 19th century voting system developers. Jacob Myers, generally recognized as the inventor of the first successful mechanical voting machine, proposed a machine where a voter could vote by inserting tokens in slots in the face of the machine. It really looked like a vending machine. The machine counted the tokens as the voter left the booth, but it also stored them in a separate pot for each candidate. At the close of the polls, the contents of the pot could be checked against the count for each candidate, if there was any suspicion that the counters weren't working right. Joseph Gray, another 19th century inventor, proposed a mechanical voting machine where pushing the voting lever punched a paper ticket as it incremented a mechanical register inside the machine. This was the first voting machine equipped with what we now call a voter-verifiable paper trail. It never caught on, but Gray clearly stated his purpose. In this manner, we have a mechanical check on the tickets, while the ticket is also a check on the register. And that's a clever idea. It came back. These 19th century proposals were forgotten. People at the time saw mechanical voting machines as inherently unbiased and mechanically incorruptible. Those who worried about corruption of the mechanism were few and far between. One of the greatest election reformers of the mid-20th century, a UC Berkeley professor named Joseph Harris, invented the Votomatic punch card voting machine as a reaction to the lack of a voter-verified paper trail on the mechanical voting machines of the time. Harris's Votomatic was incredibly cheap compared to the mechanical machines it replaced, and the ballots could be counted by computer. In the 1970s, I voted on a Votomatic in Illinois, and at the time, I thought it was an incredible step forward, moving from 19th century mechanism into the computer age. The problems with dangling Chad that would later doom the Votomatic were serious, but largely unrecognized until the election of 2000. The legacy of Harris's work lives on, though. When Harris proposed legislation in California to allow use of his new machines, he also proposed that after every election, precincts representing 1% of the voters were to be selected at random for an audit that included a hand recount of the ballots. This would defend against any corruption of the computer programs or punch card tabulators that were used to count the ballots. California enacted Harris's proposal into law in 1965, and ever since, that state has been conducting routine election audits. They do this immediately after the first count is announced, before the final certification of the vote, regardless of whether there are any recount requests. And naturally, in the event an audit discovers significant discrepancies, the candidates are entitled to request a full recount. If you talk to California election officials, they say that auditing is not a major burden, that it builds public confidence, and that it means that in the event of a request for a full recount, they have a large crew of election workers who know how to conduct a hand count because they do it routinely. Election auditing remained essentially unknown in much of the United States until the controversy surrounding Election 2000. Since then, many states have brought election auditing into practice. Most of the states doing so have followed California's example by requiring random selection of precincts for audit until the number of ballots involved exceeds a set percentage of the votes cast. Some states have changed the numbers. So, for example, Minnesota requires 5%, New York requires 3%. There's a website run by verifiedvoting.org that has state-by-state details on auditing. Currently, Iowa doesn't conduct any post-election audits. The election reform bill under consideration right now in Des Moines is large, with provisions for voter ID, signature verification, electronic poll books, and auditing. The auditing provisions are, quite frankly, odd. The bill would require an audit in February after the November general election. And it forbids the audit from changing the election results in the event a discrepancy is found. Under this proposal, an audit cannot trigger a recount or any other corrective action. While I agree that any auditing is better than none, I wonder where this rather timid auditing proposal came from. It's fair to ask, could an audit detect the millions of illegal ballots that Trump said were cast last November? Philip Stark, the UC Berkeley statistician who invented risk-limiting election audits, has noted that if the number of illegal voters in California is more than 500,000 among those who voted in the election, there's a 99.8% chance that a random sample of just 140 voters from California would find at least one of them. So the size of the sample you have to test to find this kind of fraud is not big in the face of the kind of numbers that have been alleged. Michel Chevalier, then the head of elections in Geneva, Switzerland, told me that they actually do something like the audit Stark suggests. For over a decade, Geneva voters have been allowed a choice of voting at the polls, voting by mail, or voting by internet. Given the Wild West character of the internet security today, I'm not in favor of internet voting. But the Geneva system has an interesting feature. The credentials needed for postal and internet voting in Geneva could possibly be stolen or traded. To prevent this, the election office conducts a simple survey after every election. They talk to randomly selected people whose credentials were used in the election, asking just one question. Did you vote in person, by mail, or by internet? The election office knows how each ballot was received, and if the voter indeed voted that ballot, they should remember how they did it. If a voter's credentials were bought or stolen, however, they wouldn't know how they were used. So this is a very simple measure. We could do that in Iowa with about 50% of our voters voting absentee and 50% voting at the polls. After the polls close, you ask randomly selected voters who the poll book said voted, you ask them, well, did you vote at the polls or did you vote absentee? And if they say, oh, I didn't vote, well, you know someone stole their ballot. If they say, well, I voted at the polls, but the ballot was received absentee, you have reason to question the integrity of the system. Election auditing can only accomplish very small results with paperless voting systems. Either the mechanical monsters we use here in Iowa before the 1980s or the direct recording electronic machines, many which had touch screens, that were briefly the rage 15 years ago and are still widely used in some states. With hand-marked paper ballots such as we've used in Iowa starting in the 1980s, correctly done auditing can eliminate essentially all of the questions we might have about the integrity of the voting system. David Dill at Stanford University once said that we could vote on machines made by the devil himself and still run fair elections. There are useful audits that can be conducted on paperless machines. All of these machines maintain a variety of internal records, recording when the polls open, when the polls close, when the machine is enabled for one voter to vote, when the voter pushes the cast ballot button, and things like that. Real failures in election administration have been diagnosed from these event logs. Duncan Buell at the University of South Carolina has been a leader working in this area, and earlier Martha Mahoney at the University of Miami Law School did pioneering work on event log analysis. The most interesting audit models that have been proposed to date is Philip Stark's risk-limiting audit. In such an audit, the number of ballots selected for recounting depends on the margin of the election and the degree of assurance you want that all was honest. If the election was won by a wide margin, you only need to check a few ballots to assure yourself that things were honest. The smaller the margin, the more ballots you need to check. Stark's formulas begin with the margin in the election, the number of ballots cast, and the confidence level you want in the outcome. And they tell you how many ballots to recount. While the detailed formulas are messy, there are approximations that are pretty intuitive. To assure yourself that an election with a 10% margin was honest, recounting just 10 randomly selected ballots gives some assurance, not much. When the margin is 1%, you need to recount 100 ballots to get the same assurance. If the margin is 0.1%, you should count 1,000 ballots. Colorado and several other states have begun experimenting with risk-limiting audits. Unfortunately, last fall's battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania had no provisions for routine auditing. What these states have are laws allowing recounts. I'll get to recounts later after discussing the possibility of Russian involvement, because it is also one of the justifications for the recounts. In May 2016, the Director of National Intelligence reported signs of attempted cyber attacks on several 2016 presidential campaigns. At the time, they did not identify the likely sources of the attacks, nor the victims. It appears that the purpose of the public release by our government was to get all the political campaigns to raise the level of their defenses. They did repeat some history, though, reminding us that in 2008, Chinese hackers had attempted to breach computers at both the Obama and McCain campaigns, and in 2012, there were reports of both domestic and foreign attacks on Obama and Romney's campaigns. In short, the internet these days seems to be as lawless as the stereotypical Wild West of the 19th century. In June, we learned that the Democratic National Committee was one of the victims of these attacks, that the materials stolen included copies of their opposition research on Donald Trump, and that the attacks were Russian. The Democratic National Committee said that no financial donor or personal information had been taken. Russia, of course, denied any involvement in the stories. And the news stories noted that some of the hackers appear to have had access to the DNC's computers for over a year, and that they were only expelled in early June during a major cleanup of the DNC's computer system, probably inspired by that warning from the Director of National Intelligence. We need to be clear here. Russian intelligence is naturally interested in gathering every bit of information they can about potential leaders of our country, and I hope that U.S. intelligence is just as interested in Russia and China. It would be foolish for any great power not to poke around on the internet to see what they could find out about their rivals. The question is, did Russia go beyond information gathering and attempt to intervene in the U.S. election? Just days after the revelation that the DNC was the victim, someone going by the name Guccifer 2.0 released a large pile of DNC documents to WikiLeaks, including opposition research, but also information about at least some of the major donors. My impression is that these document releases were not complete releases of everything that was stolen, but rather carefully curated collections designed for maximum impact. Early this year, FBI Director James Comey said that the RNC and several other Republican campaigns had also been hacked during the campaign, but not Trump's. This doesn't surprise me. If I'd been in charge of Russian intelligence, I'd have wanted all the information I could get about likely contenders for the presidency. In early 2016, when these hacks took place, Trump was still an outsider judged by just about everyone as unlikely to win the nomination. He may have been considered unlikely enough a candidate to be deemed not worthy of hacking at the time. I'm not an expert on Russian politics, but I have traveled in the former Soviet Union as an election observer in Kazakhstan, where I had the opportunity to speak with many of the Central Election Commission members and employees down to the technician level. I worked with the former chair of the Russian Central Election Commission as an election observer in the Netherlands. In general, the Russian and former Soviet attitude towards American interests in election integrity is a bit resentful. They don't like us telling them that their elections are less than open and honest. Well, their elections are less than open and honest. I can say that from firsthand experience. I get the impression that many in the leadership would love to see American democracy discredited. I suspect that the leadership in Russia, having harvested all the intelligence they could get on the likely candidates, had a clear interest in seeing Clinton pushed aside. She did not make friends in Russia during her term as Secretary of State, and she would have been a hard-nosed opponent as president. Trump, on the other hand, would appear from a Russian perspective to be a wannabe oligarch, a man with aspirations just like those of the Russian leadership. This naturally leads to a bias against Clinton and for Trump in the Russian leadership. We know that Russian government policy has long been to collect compromising material, known by the Russian phrase kompromat, as they call it, on everyone they can for later use when leverage is needed. You just accumulate this stuff and keep it on file just in case. The Russian investigations of U.S. political campaign was almost certainly interested in gathering compromat on the candidates. Naturally, as the election approached, Russian authorities would be expected to look at the quality of the dirt and ask, who will we have the most leverage over? Well, I don't believe that Clinton is squeaky clean. I suspect that the dirt we've seen about her use of a private email server is about as bad as they could find. We don't know what they have on Trump, but my guess, given his business dealings with various Russian oligarchs over many years, is that they have much more. Both the wannabe oligarch and the compromat argument suggest a Russian preference for Trump. But I warn that without evidence, this is just speculative justification for suspecting Russia. Where is the proof? How do we know the Russians did this? The answer lies in the way we build internet servers. From my laptop computer all the way up to the huge machines run by the likes of Google and Amazon, computers connected to the internet maintain log files. These files are retained for periods from days to weeks and then deleted so that the disk space they fill can be reused. But when something goes wrong, they are the first place an analyst should look to see what happened. These logs don't record everything that happened, but they record the metadata. Where in the world was the computer that contacted your computer, and when did it do so, but not what it did? Once the Democratic National Committee discovered it was being hacked, they extracted all the logs they could to determine where the traffic to their computers was coming from. The NSA collects far more, but the logs from the servers at the DNC have been subject to multiple independent examinations. Half of the suspicious traffic came from machines called Tor routers. The Tor is a free internet service that provides anonymized internet access. Tor is based on technology developed by the U.S. military and deliberately released into the public domain because it allows people living in totalitarian countries to avoid internet censorship. To dissidents in China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, nations that attempt to severely restrict and control internet access, Tor is a very valuable tool. Of course, Tor is a double-edged sword. Criminals use Tor, and so do spies. The use of Tor in the attacks on the U.S. campaign internet servers is to be expected. The key clues to the attacks come from the other half of the log entries, internet contacts that were not as carefully anonymized. When working over a period of a year or so, hackers sometimes don't remember to cover their tracks. And instead of coming through a service like Tor, they occasionally come in directly from their own machines or through intermediaries that maintain logs allowing tracking back to the source. The internet addresses of some of these machines were addresses previously associated with Russian groups codenamed Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. I love these code names. Also known as APT-28 and APT-29. We don't officially know who these are, but they've been tracked for a long time, long enough for the trackers to name them. How do we know that these are Russian? Over many years, their activities have been followed and a daily pattern of activity has been observed. They work during normal working hours in the time zone of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Furthermore, they don't normally work on Russian state holidays. We can't say for sure that these organizations are part of the Russian government, but the level of sophistication they show strongly suggests that they are closely allied with Russian intelligence. Here it's clear that Russia routinely attempts to maintain plausible deniability, claiming that actions such as these are the acts of rogue agents and not the government. On many occasions, however, plausible deniability shifts to become implausible denial. In 2007, attackers from Russia shut down the web servers of a number of Estonian organizations. Russia denied any government involvement, claiming that the attacks were the actions of individuals working without any sanction. And then in the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, similar cyber attacks were coordinated with military action against Georgia. Can they really deny government involvement? On November 1, I put together an analysis of the situation for a press conference convened by Garry Kasparov's organization, PutinTrump.org. He supports neither. I concluded that the structure of U.S. election administration would make it very difficult for Russia or any other outsider to directly hack the vote. Our elections are extraordinarily decentralized, with over 5,000 local election offices, mostly at the county level. These local offices do most of the work. There's no one-size-fits-all hack that could be used to make national-scale changes. There are a few states with very centralized election administration. Georgia and Maryland are examples. Just this past week, we learned that Georgia's election center had indeed been hacked. But to what end? Georgia is a safely red state, and Maryland is safely blue. An outsider would be hard-pressed to change the results in these states without being noticed. A smart hacker would focus on battleground states, not states that were so safe. And in those battleground states, a hacker should focus on a few large counties where small changes could swing the results statewide. So go after Wayne County, Michigan, or go after Dane County, Wisconsin. I suggested on November 1 that such an attack would be far more difficult than releasing carefully curated, stolen, or even fictional information through the news media. Curated leaking through WikiLeaks, building credibility and then releasing hard-to-deny fictions at the last moment seemed to me to be the most dangerous strategy because it could change more votes at lower cost than any alternative. I think the results of the election have proven me right, although it's not clear that we've seen fiction from the leaks. After the election, I believe it was critical to try to prove that the actual vote count had not been hacked. That's why I and a number of other computer scientists, notably Alex Halderman at the University of Michigan, joined forces with the Green Party candidate Jill Stein to file for recounts in Wisconsin, Michigan, and California. The Trump campaign poured significant effort into blocking these recounts, and I think this was ill-advised but expected. The winners in an election generally discourage any investigation into the possibility that there were irregularities in that election. The winner's position is invariably, "We won, get over it." It always falls on the losers to ask the hard questions about the integrity of the system. In Wisconsin, we reached exactly the conclusion that I'd hoped for. While the ballot count in the state was not perfect, I don't expect perfection in any effort as complex as a presidential election. But the errors in the count didn't come anywhere near the magnitude that could have changed the outcome. On Election Day in Wisconsin, Trump won fair and square. It was an uphill battle to reach that conclusion, and we didn't get the full hand count we hoped for. But we had observers in many of the counties that conducted their recounts by machine. In some of these counties, despite no rule requiring it, they actually did a hand count anyway without anyone prompting them to do it before the machine count. In other counties, it was not hard to talk the officials into hand counting before their machine count. And yet at others, we found Trump and Clinton volunteers who were willing to look over the shoulders of the election officials and demand to briefly look at each individual ballot so that they could independently count them as they were fed into the machines. In sum, at least in Wisconsin, the system worked. The story was more fraught in Michigan, where the recount law has the unusual feature that if there's any discrepancy between the number of ballots the precinct election officials say were issued to voters and the number found in the ballot box, then no examination of the ballots is permitted. So if just one voter takes his ballot from the polling place as a souvenir, a recount of that polling place is not permitted. This, along with skilled maneuvering by Trump's legal team, stopped the Michigan recount before more than a few counties could complete recounts. In Pennsylvania, the situation was worse. Many Pennsylvania counties vote on paperless electronic voting machines where there is really no useful possibility of a full audit. Fortunately, some of these machines are so old that hacking would only be possible with direct physical access to the machines. You can't get that over the internet from St. Petersburg. There's no way Russia could do that. The biggest barrier to a recount in Pennsylvania, though, is that Pennsylvania law requires 3 voters in each precinct to file a request for a recount in that precinct before it can proceed. In effect, nobody can mount a statewide recount in Pennsylvania without having an organization on the ground in advance, prepared to go hunting in a very short deadline for lots of affidavits demanding the recount. Unfortunately, many of the judges and lawyers with whom we interacted during the recount battles asked for proof that the recount would change the result before it could be permitted. This is a very odd standard, since only the ballots themselves could offer proof, and also because a recount that detects no irregularities is actually more valuable than one that detects problems, precisely because it shows that our election system is trustworthy, at least in as far as the actual vote count is concerned. Another fear, based on the hacks of voter registration databases, was that an attempt would be made to disenfranchise voters. An outsider with access to complete registration records of voters could, for example, request absentee ballots on behalf of voters they wish to disenfranchise, having those ballots mailed to random overseas mailing addresses. Voters showing up at the polls under such circumstances would be forced to cast provisional ballots. Even if all those provisional ballots are counted, the result would be long lines as election officials deal with problem votes. Fortunately, on election day, nobody reported evidence of such an attack. There were not unusual numbers of voters attempting to vote for whom absentee ballots had been requested. Another fear, the absentee ballot attack I just described is not merely hypothetical. It happened in Miami in August 2013 during a primary election. Fortunately, the perpetrator was amateurish enough that the county election office caught on, the perpetrator was caught, and eventually agreed to a plea deal and a year of probation. I continue to advocate for election auditing. I wish the audit provisions of Paul Pate's election reform bill that's now up for discussion in Des Moines were stronger, but I have long felt that any auditing is better than none. I agreed to give this talk back in November when we still had no idea how the story would end. And as it turns out, the story isn't over. So someone will have to do something to tell us what happened a year from now. So that's my summary of how we got where we are.
So this question is, why hasn't the IRS been hacked for Trump's taxes? That's maybe speculation.
I would have to speculate. So the answer has to be, who knows? It might even have been hacked. The information might simply being retained for the most opportune moment for release. We don't know.
Was there any reliability to reports that the WikiLeaks info released regarding the DNC had been edited and changed before being released?
I haven't seen any evidence that information was changed. What I strongly suspect is careful curation and selective release of things timed to achieve the most damage. That's very different from altering things. But selective release of information can be very damaging.
We're going to have to go back and forth here. What is your opinion of the picture voter ID proposed by Pate?
My opinion of the proposed voter ID law is rather low. As I said, you have to ask whether requiring voter ID will turn away more voters than it admits. All the evidence of improper voting that was discovered by Pate's predecessor, none of those improperly cast ballots would have been stopped by voter ID requirement. They were all registered voters who shouldn't have been registered, perhaps. And they would have been issued ID cards under his proposal. So, as near as I can tell, his proposal, after they watered it down and made it, we'll issue free IDs to every new voter who needs one. By that point, it just became an expensive proposal so that they could have a voter ID requirement, putting a financial burden on all the local election offices to help. I don't understand it.
Thank you. This question says, great lecture, loved it, but I think you obscured the way Russia probably determined the election. The carefully curated emails were designed to damage Clinton. Where were the email releases that damaged Trump? This is how the election was affected by Russia.
I sort of thought that's what I said. The selective release, when you have two candidates, one of whom you would like to win but control, and the other one you would like to lose, you release your damaging compromat on the one you want to lose in advance of the election, and you hold on to the damaging compromat on the one that you would like to win to be released selectively when it serves you the best advantage. That is, when you need to hit them hard for doing something you didn't like. As long as he's a nice puppy, he won't get scolded.
Is it feasible to have a national voting standard, i.e. this is a single voting ballot system for all states to follow?
You know, that's something people have been talking about for a long time, and I'm very wary of it. If you'd asked me to propose a national voting standard in 1974, 1976, when I first voted in a presidential election, it was vote-o-matic ballots I was voting on in Illinois, and I thought they were cool. It's cheap, cost-effective, voter-verified paper trail, although they didn't have the term back then. There's a lot to be said for vote-o-matic ballots. And I would have said, well, gee, given the economics, given the reliability, given everything I knew about them then, I would have said we should use them nationwide. And I would have been dead wrong. And in the process, I would have crushed what at the time was the beginning of a revolution in voting technology, when lots of different developers were having all kinds of neat ideas. When Westinghouse was just beginning to experiment with optical scanners for counting ballots. When this company outside Chicago was just beginning to experiment with the video voter, which was what they called it. It got used in 2 counties. All these neat experiments with new technologies wouldn't have happened. They would have been crushed by vote-o-matic. And then when we discovered the real problems with vote-o-matic, we wouldn't have had any alternative. So I would like there to be a vibrant market for voting machines with at least 3 serious competitors, not a big monopoly and a couple almost companies. And I would like them to be pushing alternatives that are really different from each other, so that if we discover something systematically wrong, we'd have something that we could move to. And a national uniform voting standard in a country the size of the United States would prevent that. The other thing is, one of the worst things you can do is have an emergency, let's replace all our machines. They did this twice in Florida in a period of 4 years, first replacing all the vote-o-matics with touchscreen machines, and then throwing out all the touchscreen machines and replacing them with scanners. That's really foolish. We should design in terms of a constant rollover so that you don't have a boom-bust economy among the voting system manufacturers. They should be building a few new machines every year, and they should be rolled in gradually. That's what we need in terms of administration. And then the problem is to make sure that each new generation of machines is at least as good as the ones it's replacing, in terms of human factors, in terms of accessibility, in terms of all these other dimensions on which we want our machines to work.
I've got a couple of questions that kind of generally reflect this one. This one says, the news yesterday said that WikiLeaks reported that hacks in our election were done by the CIA and deliberately left a trail to falsely implicate Russia. Is it possible to falsify the hacking source?
The dreaded false flag attack. I mean, it's something real. People try to do false flag attacks all the time. One of the things, for example, that's happened that we're well aware of is the Russian attacks on Estonia during that happened before a year before the Russo-Georgian War. Those attacks, many of them originated from server farms in the United States, because you can open an account in a server farm and then use that machine to do an attack. And so you had to do a little bit of research to find out who actually paid for the account on the server farm that was used to run the attack. And Amazon sells computing services to anyone who asks for it. Just all you need is a credit card number, and you can host your websites or host your applications on their servers. So the answer is, False flag attacks are always a possibility. This is why it's so important to be able to attribute an attack to a known actor who's been acting for a number of years. And that's what happens with these two apt groups, or apartment number groups, the Cozy Bear and Fuzzy Bear, whatever their names were. As to the revelations about the CIA, what we have about the CIA is a very clear revelation that they developed their own hackingware independently of the National Security Agency. And the interesting thing is that the NSA is fairly tightly regulated. It's been publicly known for a long time that the NSA does hacking. And so there is an oversight mechanism. No matter how flawed, there is a well-defined oversight mechanism for NSA hacking. The FISA court, the Federal Intelligence Security Court. And Federal Intelligence Security Act, that's the name of the court. Everything FISA does is classified, and the judges have security clearances to deal in these national security cases. The CIA, on the other hand, hasn't been known to be doing this, and so we're not sure of the integrity of their operation. We're not sure who they're hacking. We're not sure of whether they are responsible in their use of these tools. It's understandable that they would want to use them, to have their own tools. It's just typical government bureaucratic infighting. But I haven't seen any evidence that they were hacking election campaigns and doing any false flag stuff. All I've seen is evidence, is this huge pile of evidence that says that they have their own internal electronic warfare group that's working independently of the Defense Department and independently of the NSA. And Defense and NSA are out in the open. We know what they're doing. We have these oversight mechanisms in place. The CIA, we don't.
Could you give any, I guess I'm probably asking any more history on Russia trying to influence elections anywhere, I guess?
Well, it's pretty clear that Russia, particularly in the days of the Soviet Union, was heavily involved in all of the Russian satellite country elections, to the extent they had elections, and was heavily involved in attempting to influence things elsewhere. Post-Soviet, it's very clear. I mean, Russian influence on former Soviet countries. I mean, they've invaded them with armies, and I suspect they've also done things that were less grotesque and less lethal, but just as controlling. In fact, one of the things that's interesting about Kazakhstan and visiting there is the extent to which Kazakhstan is managing to attempt to chart its own course that's just independent enough of their former colonial rulers to be distinctly independent, and yet without offending Russia. And it's an interesting tightrope act to watch. But I'm pretty sure that Russia, had they been able to do things during the days of the Red Scare, would have done them. But they were so far out on a limb then that I don't think they could have much influence. And I also think they were more amateurish during the Cold War than they are post-Cold War. I think the amount of contact between Russia and the United States since the Cold War ended has allowed Russians to have a much greater understanding of us, which is to our immense benefit, but also poses risks when they use that understanding against us.
Okay. This will be the last one. I had a couple of kind of this general theme. Have estimates been made of the number or percentage of Bernie supporters who did not vote for Clinton because of the release of DNC emails showing their Clinton favoritism? Does that make sense?
I'll leave that to the political scientists. I'm not a political scientist. My focus is on things that at least touch on the technological side of the election business. And tracking Bernie supporters who were dismayed by things is difficult. It's just like, I know people who were dismayed just by the revelations that Clinton might have mishandled classified material, even though it's not clear that any of it fell into the wrong hands, because her classified material was on her server, which appears not to have been hacked. Luckily enough. I mean, this may be just due to obscurity and amateurism, but sometimes you're lucky.
Okay. All right. So we'll conclude our program now. Please give a big thanks to Doug Jones. I want to thank our sponsors. As I mentioned, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honor program, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, and then our special sponsors, Joyce and Dick Somerville, Mace and Kay Braverman. And we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. And as a token of our appreciation, we'd like to present Doug with our coveted Foreign Relations Council mug. We are adjourned.
Wow.